My name is Mark Downs. I'm the director from the Small Arms Survey. We don't have an overall facilitator today. We're going to share this role amongst a number of us. But this event is hosted by the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, in partnership with ourselves here at the Small Arms Survey. This is the last in a series of regional webinars organized by UNIDIR, and it's our pleasure for the Small Arms Survey to be partnering for this iteration with WeArg States. I'd like to start with a few housekeeping rules, if I could. We'd ask you to please mute your microphones, please turn on your video if that's possible, and obviously try to make use of the chat function if you have any questions you'd like to ask throughout the event. We'll also invite you to use the raise a hand function if you'd like to make an intervention during the questions and answer session at the end of the webinar and after our panelists have spoken. As you probably know, 2024 is an important year for small arms control, with the PoA RevCon 4 meeting coming up from the 18th to the 28th of June. And this will be followed by the 10th Conference of State Parties of the Arms Trade Treaty between the 19th and the 23rd of August. While we can't predict what the outcome of these two meetings will be at this stage, we can be sure that gender will be an important and central topic of discussion in both of these meetings. The Small Arms Survey, here we have a long history of working on gender responsive arms control, as far back as 2014, when we produced a yearbook on the topic of women and guns. Since then, we've been regularly updating our global violent deaths database to provide sex disaggregated data on global trends in firearms related deaths. And we'd like to thank Canada for supporting some of our earlier work in this area. And of course, our current donors, Germany and Switzerland. The Small Arms Survey, our approach to gender has three main components. I would say the first one is we look at the gendered impact of armed violence. Here, I would say a number of quick snapshots from our work in this area. So the first is that our latest figures show that in 2021, of the 260,000 violent deaths committed by firearms, 91% of the victims were men and 8% were women. Although far more men than women are killed, women are disproportionately impacted by other forms of gender-based violence facilitated by small arms, especially in the cases of domestic violence. From our work in Ukraine, we found that nearly half of civilian men would like to own a firearm, as it would make them feel safer. But only 19% of women, however, said that they would feel safer having a firearm at home. This exemplifies how the threat of firearms can be different for both men and for women. Our second pillar of our work on gender and small arms control is that we support the integration of gender perspectives in small arms related policies and programs. And one of the challenges we've been seeking to overcome in this area is the fact that although national small arms control efforts increasingly incorporate a gender perspective, they are very rarely aligned with national efforts to implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Similarly, national action plans and WPS often mention armed violence, but don't mention arms control. In response to this, what we've been bringing to these two communities is to try to bring them together to build a bridge between the WPS and the arms control people. And we brought them together in places like Ukraine and in Chile to produce more collaborative research, which will provide an evidence base to include gender responsive arms control in both policy frameworks. The third pillar of our work on gender and small arms control is that we support efforts to increase the meaningful participation of women in processes related to small arms control. We know that there are plenty of qualified women with the potential to contribute to small arms control processes, but sometimes there are capacity and confidence gaps, but we also know that the design of national arms control processes and the focus on the arms themselves rather than on the impact of the arms can exclude women from both public institutions and from civil society. So we're currently piloting some how-to guides on designing more inclusive policymaking and policy evaluation processes. So from these examples that I've given and from, I'm sure, many of your own work, I'm sure that the importance for gender-responsive small arms control is clear and self-evident. However, today we live in a world that is characterized by a growing gender backlash. Continuing this work within the PoA and the ATT requires a more proactive approach and leveraging strength in numbers. Strategizing to define shared objectives and common red lines and organizing joint statements were key to protecting gender-related language in recent outcome documents of both the PoA and the ATT, as well as the open-ended working group on conventional ammunition. So we therefore hope that you will find this webinar both informative and that it contributes to your ongoing collaborative efforts to promote gender-responsive small arms control in these two key policy frameworks. Now, with that short introduction, let me pass the floor, and it is my pleasure to pass the floor to Hannah Salama, researcher in Gender and Disarmament Program within UNIDIR, and to share some of her thoughts on gender in the Arms Trade Treaty. Hannah, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, for this introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. It's really great to be here this afternoon for the final briefing on fostering gender-responsive arms control, and it's great to see so many of you as well. So for my presentation, I would like to give you an overview of how gender perspectives are included in the Arms Trade Treaty. And today we're very fortunate to also have Hinwei from Control Arms, who will also speak about the ATT. So it's a really good opportunity to discuss ways forward in this treaty. So just by way of introduction, next slide, please. The ATT is an international treaty that regulates the trade in conventional arms, and it seeks to prevent and eradicate the illicit trade and diversion of conventional arms. Now, it's wider than just small arms. It covers 8 categories of weapons, but it also includes small arms and light weapons. But it's an important tool for small arms control because it's a legally binding treaty. In addition, it's one of the few treaties which explicitly considers gender by having a specific provision that is aimed at preventing gender-based violence. So just to give you a bit of a snapshot, the ATT has 113 state parties, and actually 25 of them are in the Western Europe and other regional grouping by the UN. So as I said, while the PoA deals with the illicit trade of small arms, the Arms Trade Treaty is seeking to prevent the illicit trades, but it mainly deals with the legal transfer of weapons. But it also recognizes that this legal trade can have harmful gendered impacts if these weapons are diverted or misused. Next slide, please. So I think there was a lot of data that was mentioned by Mark, and data is always an issue when it comes to looking at the gendered impacts of small arms. However, as Mark mentioned, we know that the ownership of firearms is very gendered, victimization as well, and that women are actually more at risk of specific forms of armed violence, which are not necessarily lethal. So according to a UNODC study, the women and girls constitute the majority, around 55% of victims of intimate partner violence or family member homicides. In the Small Arms Survey's recent reports, in some countries with the highest rate of femicides, we see that small arms are used in almost half of the cases. And at UNIDIR, we also published a study called Addressing Weapons in Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. And this study tried to dig deeper into the interlinkages between CRSV and the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons. What we found was data that was available in 6 countries that showed that between 70 to 90% of incidents of sexual violence in conflict involved a firearm. And just to give you a perspective, according to the UN data, around 94% of survivors and victims of CRSV are women and girls. So here we note that firearms plays a significant role in facilitating all kinds of gender-based violence and not only lethal violence. Next slide, please. So as I said, the ATT is one of the few and first arms control treaty that recognize the risk of GBV facilitated by weapons. So basically, it does that in two main ways. First, Article 6 prohibits states from authorizing arms transfers, which can be used to commit war crimes or grave breaches of IHL. And second, Article 7 also requires exporting states to assess the potential that arms can be used to commit or facilitate serious violation of international human rights law, and goes further in Article 7.4 by requiring states to carry out risk assessment on the risk that exported arms and related items can be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of GBV. In addition, the treaty requires states to consider implementing mitigation measures to mitigate these risks. So, certain form of gender-based violence, such as conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and other forms of sexual violence, have been established as both a serious violation of international humanitarian law and a war crime, both in international and non-international armed conflicts. So what does that mean? It actually means that the risk of CRSV as a specific form of gender-based violence can be considered under both 6 and 7, and of course, all other forms of GBV can be considered under Article 7, and especially Article 7.4. So this is what is on paper at the outset. And also to build on this, in 2019, the theme of the 5th Conference of State Parties was gender, and actually gender-based violence, under the Latvian presidency. And this was really a milestone for gender perspectives in the treaty, because during CSP5, states adopted a number of decisions and recommendations, including improving gender balance representation in meetings on the ATT, improving the disaggregated data collection to further understand the gendered impacts of armed violence, and strengthening the implementation of Article 7.4 on the GBV-related risk assessments. So next slide, please. Despite this very good progress, which I would say is very good language and progress on paper, we see that there's still challenges in implementing both the treaty obligations and the decisions and recommendations of CSP 5. So the first interesting thing to note is that I recently looked at the reporting templates of a number of conventional arms treaties, and actually, gender is not part of the initial and annual reports that states have to submit as part of their obligation on reporting for the ATT. So that's interesting, because we don't really have a way of knowing of whether states implemented gender-related provisions or the recommendation for CSP 5. So this is something definitely to consider as part of our discussion. Other challenges that I think Hinaway will also mention is just challenges related to implementing Article 7.4. Often exporting licensing officers will cite that there is a lack of specific data linking arms with specific gender-based violence as a challenge to consider gender-based violence. And there is also a lack of understanding of what we mean by mitigation measures specifically for gender-based violence. So really looking forward to hearing more on that. Next slide, please. Regarding the gender representation in treaty meetings, we note that women are still underrepresented at official meetings, comprising an average of only 34% of diplomats. And just to say that in technical roles, UNIDIR also has done a study on women's participation and involvement in technical roles, and the percentage is far lower, so about 12% on that. So finally, I wanted to end by giving some ideas of what we can do to actually overcome some of these challenges that we're seeing. So at a national level, definitely the recommendation on strengthening national data collection mechanisms on gender-based violence to include the means of harms is a recurring one, but one that still needs to be implemented. And the second one, which is also an important recommendation that we're putting forth in the UN PoA, is to ensure inclusive participations in meetings and dialogues related to small arms controls and policies and programs, and related to policies and programs to reduce gender-based violence, domestic violence. And this could mean including organizations that represent survivors of GBV and CRSV. Next slide, please. And at the international level, as Mark mentioned, there are many opportunities this year to strengthen gender perspectives in the ATT, but also in the UN PoA. For the ATT, it's important to note that last year's CSP, so CSP 9, the outcome document really encouraged states to keep the risk of conventional arms being used to commit or facilitate serious acts of GBV and violence against women and children as an important topic for attention, and to initiate discussion and exchange of information on good practices in the CSP 10 cycle. So for the upcoming CSP 10, this can take place in many forms, but it could be for state parties to come together and initiate concrete discussions on risk assessment and how those are implemented with regards to GBV. It can be promoting a better understanding of what GBV mitigation measures are, sharing some best practices on those, including on data collection, and supporting the proposal of creating a good practice guide on preventing GBV through the ATT. Finally, I think this year's theme for the CSP, which is interagency cooperation, emphasizes the importance of cooperations between national agencies working on implementing the ATT, but it can also mean cooperation between national authorities preventing gender-based violence and authorities working on export controls. So this is something to keep in mind. There is definitely scope to include national agencies working on gender equality and the WPS in the discussions on arms exports and imports, and perhaps even to invite one of them to be part of your delegation at the CSP 10. So these are just some ideas from my part, and I really look forward to discussing. And I will hand over to Callum, who will give you some ideas, I'm sure, about the UN PoA.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And once again, it's always a pleasure to partner with UNIDIR. So my name is Callum Watson. I'm the gender coordinator at the Small Arms Survey based in Geneva. And what I'm going to do today is to give you a little bit of an overview of the PoA itself, but then also some of the main topics that we expect to be coming up, noting that we actually have a big advantage compared to the previous regional webinars and that we've actually been able to see a copy of the zero draft of the outcome document. So first of all, just some very basic background information on the Programme of Action. So it was adopted by the General Assembly in 2001. Now, unlike the Arms Trade Treaty that Hannah just presented, it's a set of politically binding global commitments, which means that unlike the Arms Trade Treaty that has a limited number of states parties, the Programme of Action theoretically is applicable to the whole, all of the UN member states. And it aims to curb the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects, with particular focuses on areas such as improving national small arms laws, import-export controls, stockpile management, and engaging in international cooperation and assistance. It was also accompanied from 2005 by a tracing instrument that looks at improving international collaboration on weapons tracing. Now, if we look at the gender-related aspects of the Programme of Action, perhaps it was reflective of its time in 2001. The single reference we find to gender in the original document is that the states parties mentioned, or the member states mentioned being gravely concerned about the illicit arms trade's devastating consequences on children, as well as the negative impact on women and the elderly. And that was the extent of all of the gender-related references that were found in the Programme of Action document. There's been a lot of progress since then. So if we look at what the biennial meeting of states, the 8th one in 2022 said, we see language that we see at the bottom of the screen there that encouraged mainstreaming a gender perspective into the implementation of the Programme of Action, as well as efforts to address the differential impact of the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons on women, men, girls, and boys. You've got much more of an inclusive understanding of gender, and you see several paragraphs dedicated to how exactly this should be implemented. Now, some of these provisions were hotly debated during the deliberations of BMS 8. However, Costa Rica led 56 member states, in addition to the European Union, to have to share a gender joint statement that really helped boost the inclusion of a lot of these gender-related provisions in the final document. And that's something that has also been effective within the framework of the Arms Trade Treaty and the Open-Ended Working Group on Ammunition, which led to the Global Ammunition Framework. So what are the topics that we see when we talk about gender in the Programme of Action? So they tend to look at things such as the full, equal, meaningful, and effective participation of women. It looks at differentiated impacts of the illicit trade in small arms on women, men, girls, and boys. It calls for data disaggregated so far by sex, age, and disability, gender-sensitive policymaking, exchanging on national practices on implementing a gender perspective, eradicating illicit small arms as a method of combating gender-based violence and sexual violence in conflict. So that's GBV and SVIC. Cooperation with civil society, youth, affected people, parliamentarians, industry, and the private sector, as well as coordination between the Programme of Action and Women, Peace and Security focal points. And you'll also note there's a fair amount of language on coordination with the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are the topics that we've seen in the past. And I think I would highlight that the primary objective of many states is simply to ensure that we retain the gender-related language in these so far 8 different areas. But when we look at the zero draft, there have been some attempts to shift the language and perhaps make it more progressive. I'm not going to look at all of the areas, but I'm going to look at a couple of the key ones. The first one looks at participation, and we see a very subtle change from the previous document from BMS 8, from ensuring the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women to addressing the barriers to the meaningful participation of women. And what that essentially is about is moving from a kind of open door policy where national small arms commissions, for example, say, you know, the door is open to women and we've done everything we can, we've invited them, we've provided training, to actually understanding why it is that women can't participate in a meaningful way. So is it because of certain structural barriers? Perhaps so you're inviting civil society during the day where they're not able to attend, or you're having your meetings in faraway locations that require resources to spend the night. Or perhaps women are not taken seriously in these meetings, or there's problems with gender bias or gender-related harassment. So the emphasis here is to shift on understanding what the barriers are and to address those. Equally, what's interesting is we've seen a new provision which reflects what Hannah was saying from the 5th Conference of States Parties in the Arms Trade Treaty, to try and walk the walk of what the POA says within POA deliberations themselves. So there's also efforts to encourage the equal, full, and effective participation of women and men in meetings of the Programme of Action and International Tracing Instrument. The next area then has to do with disaggregated data. So historically, the outcome documents have looked at disaggregating data by sex, age, and disability. Now, it's very important that we do disaggregate these kinds of data. We need to know when a firearm is used to commit a crime, and if it's used to commit a crime, was the victim a man or a woman, or perhaps a different gender minority, depending on the way in which data is collected in different countries. What that allows us to do is to have a targeted response. And essentially what this change is doing is reflecting the General Assembly Resolution 7755 of 2022. It came out just after the 8th biennial meeting of states of the POA on women, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. And it introduces, where feasible, and I know that in some Western countries, not all of these would be feasible, the disaggregation of data by income gender, age, race, ethnicity, marital status, migration status, disability, geographic location, and other characteristics relevant in national contexts. And what this would do is, while it might be unrealistic to disaggregate by all of these at once, it would encourage where there is a particular issue against a particular group that we would collect data on this in order to have a targeted response. And one example of this is in Latin America, where the Organization of American States, in partnership with some regional civil society organizations, have begun to disaggregate data on whether people were targeted on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. It identified that trans women are particularly targeted, and it also identified that since 2017, the primary method of killing of trans women in Central America has become firearms, and that's directly linked to the fact that there's much larger proliferation of illicit firearms legally procured in the United States. So they're able to then have a targeted response to that particular group. There's also a discussion when we're looking at gender sensitive policy about whether the word should be gender sensitive, gender responsive, or gender transformative. So I thought I'd just give a very quick guide to what these different terms mean. So gender neutral basically means you ignore the role of gender. Gender sensitive means that you acknowledge that gender roles, norms, and relations lead to different experiences. Once you get to gender responsive, you're beginning to actively try and address the differentiated needs of different groups of women, men, girls, and boys, so that everybody can benefit equally from a policy or program. So that's the shift from sensitive to responsive. We've also noticed, however, that some countries are beginning to talk about gender transformative approaches, and that is examining how a policy or program may contribute to maintaining a status quo that perpetuates inequality. So what gender transformative approaches seek to do is to contribute to shifts in norms, roles, and relations that would lead to equality and perhaps address some of the root causes that lead to discrimination in the first place. But of course, this is something that would always be done in partnership with people on the ground to ensure that you're respecting local and national ownership. Another topic then is widening notions of civil society. So first of all, there has been a reference to victims and survivors, which we haven't seen since BMS 7. There's sometimes reluctance to talk about this group because there may be a financial implication, but if we don't do that, then perhaps we omit those people who've actually experienced armed violence from discussions on small arms control. There's also a movement to shift from just talking about women's civil society to others that work on gender equality. That would include those that work on things like men and masculinities, as well as youth. And youth is a particularly important topic for the African group. Just in the statistic below there, we look at firearms mortality per 100,000. So this is from 2000, but the situation hasn't really changed. Most people don't really feel that they live under the threat of firearms, but in Brazil, we noticed that it is a problem. Recife in Brazil has a larger problem. Men are twice as likely to be affected by firearms-related violence. But when we look at men aged between 20 and 29, we see it's 4 times as likely. So often we find that youth are the ones who are using illicit weapons, most exposed to illicit weapons, and also suffering secondary impacts such as gender-based violence. So that's why it might be important to include youth perspectives. There are also a few new topics on the table. One of them I wanted to talk about is demand perspectives, and this is something that the Small Arms Survey has been working on. So the idea behind this is that efforts to control supply may have a limited impact if you don't also look at why there is a high demand for illicit weapons. Otherwise, what simply might happen is you close down an illicit route, and then because there's still the demand, there'll be another trade route to reach those who are seeking to acquire illicit weapons. Or as we've seen with new technologies, people start to use things like 3D printing to subvert the need to go through borders altogether. Sometimes demand then is tied to other issues such as poverty, marginalization, and insecurity. So what this would say is addressing all of these together might lead to more sustainable solutions. The question mark then is, how come it's gendered? And we've seen that there's a couple of mentions there of gender-related motivations and the link with masculinities. So sometimes the gendered roles, norms, and expectations, particularly placed on men, can influence whether they desire to own illicit firearms or not. Sometimes owning a firearm is seen as having a symbolic value of being a man. Sometimes guns are used to fulfill certain gendered expectations, such as demonstrating your ability to protect your family or to earn money, even if it's through illicit means. And sometimes guns are used to assert power over other women and men through forms of gender-based violence. So there's clearly a gender dimension to the demand side. Originally, the POA did actually talk about addressing both demand and supply factors, and doing this would allow for opportunities to draw expertise from other areas such as criminology, sociology, and public health in order to have a more comprehensive response. And I'll share a link in a second to the publication that we wrote on this topic. One other topic, just to end then, is the open-ended technical expert group, which has been put on the table, and its mandate is to look at various developments in technology in areas such as polymers, marking, 3D printing, and other new developments in small arms manufacturing technology and design. On the current zero draft, there is no gender language at all in this area. We might imagine that there could be a possibility for some entry points reflecting the provisions throughout the document in areas such as meaningful participation of women and ensuring geographical diversity, considering the different impacts of these new technologies, ensuring that data is disaggregated, and considering how they might be used to commit gender-based violence and sexual violence in conflict. We would also see a role for civil society, including women's rights, gender equality, and youth organizations. So that's an area that there might be some opportunities for WEOG states to add some language. So just to conclude, we know that WEOG states play a very important role by demonstrating what's possible in the implementation of the program of action. We know that many of the new practices are developed in WEOG states. So these are the kinds of things that can be shared at the international level. We know that WEOG states also have convening power and resources for things like joint statements, side events, and developing common positions that can be key to ensuring that there are gender-related provisions in the outcome documents. And we also know that WEOG states can shape what is funded through international cooperation and assistance in these different areas. So I will leave it there. If you'd like to read more, we have a dedicated website for the RevCon. We have a whole lot of documents coming out and some podcasts, including one with both myself and Hannah Salama. But with that, I will now pass over to Renata Delacroix, the head of UNIDIR's Gender and Disarmament Program, to introduce our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Callum and Hannah, for these very interesting presentations, full of data and information and analysis, as well as ideas for states to take forward, both at the ATT and the UN PoA meeting. The conversation we're having here today, it's part of a series that UNIDIR has been carrying out of regional consultations and dialogues with the UN regional groups. We already went through all the various groups, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to be joined here today with a conversation focused on WEOG states, which is the final event we have in this format before the UN PoA, which is in just a couple of weeks. And then the ATT meeting here in Geneva as well. So I'm based in Geneva, but we also hope we have some colleagues who are based in different countries, and also some New York-based diplomats maybe joining us as well, although it's a bit early on their side. Now we will move to the panel discussion part of our Zoom meeting today. So we have three expert panelists joining us. And I have questions for each of them, and I'll introduce them as I go. But just to say, we will have a moment for Q&A afterwards, where everyone in the meeting can pose questions to Hannah and Callum, as well as to our panelists. But also feel free to write questions on the chat, or share resources as I see it's been going on. I think we would like this to be as interactive as possible. So the first speaker in our panel is Pilar Masegosa, who is a diplomat based in Geneva. She represents Spain. She's a counselor at the Permanent Mission of Spain to the UN in Geneva. And Spain is one of the countries that is very active in arms control and disarmament, and always brings a gender lens to their work as well. So very, very pleased to have Pilar here with us. And Pilar, if you could tell us a bit, what are Spain's priorities at the moment with regards to gender and conventional arms control? What opportunities, actions are you pursuing this year? Maybe with a reference to, the upcoming meetings. I think the ATT is one that you cover. So we'd like to hear from you. Pilar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Renata, for your introduction. Let me share a short presentation that I will have prepared. Sorry. Let's see if I can do it. Okay, here we are. So first of all, let me thank UNIDIR to invite me to this meeting and overall to foster agenda issues in the arms control agenda. I have the following presentation. In short, in brief presentation, I will focus in 3 points: the national level, the international agenda, and the present and future goals. The first point that should be in mind is the double objective. First of all, a cross-cutting gender perspective should be part of all national policies, to later on to focus on some specificities according to the subject. In the case of arms control, fostering gender responsible arms control. The process, how we seen according to the previous explanation, once we have the gender issues in the national agenda, we can pass through the feminist foreign policy to push it into the international agenda, to help other countries and through international cooperation to boost in an international forum some progress to get to some goals, that is the full implementation. At national level, as you may know, Spain has been a society demand for decades to push for a gender perspective, and is reflected in our legislation. Our normative framework is wide in gender equality or gender issues, from even our national constitutions in the 80s, the organic law for effective equality of women and men in 2007, or even the action plan for implementation of the 2030 agenda in 2019, that lead us to a wide implementation, not only at national level, but also a regional and even local one. A cornerstone in our legislation was the Spanish feminist foreign policy that was issued in 2021, and that established some principles, instruments, lines of action, and actors that mainstream the gender perspective. Let me underline some instruments, at least for the Spanish case, that is the European Union, the multilateral diplomacy, and the development cooperation. Some lines of action, the most important one is the Agenda for Women, Peace and Security, and of course should be involved with many actors. That is the case of the UN, NGOs, academia, and the private sector. Our focus in international agenda for this year, 2024, are going to be of course, the ATT treaty. We will try to foster and to boost the gender perspective. Of course, in 2 weeks, we have let's hope the approval of the program of action for small and light weapons in New York. And also we will hope to have some references to gender issues. Of course, the Agenda for Women, Peace and Security, we have the anniversary in also time. I have to underline that Spain has already the second national plan for the implementation of this agenda, and it's the first time that is referred to small and light arms. And the last but not least is the Summit of the Future in September this year, through the political declaration. It's crucial to have reference to women and arms control and disarmament and gender in general. Let's hope that some other countries and civil society will have the same priorities that we have. The progress, some initiatives that we have been carrying on in the last months, we have been presenting some working papers in the CSP9. As you may remember, Spain with Mexico and a small arms survey presented the document Mitigating the Risk of Arms Violence Against People on the Basis of Their Actual and Perceived Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And also under the Spanish presidency of the working group on the effective application of the treaty, we boost and we support the Argentinian proposal of a study on the prevention of violence for gender issues in the use of arms. There have been other initiatives. I, for example, want to underline ones organized by UN Women, that there was an initiative for questionnaires on national efforts to prevent violence against women linked to small and light weapons that we participated. And also we have been pushing for some gender reference, for example, in the first committee with a joint statement on gender and disarmament, or in the conference on disarmament, the agenda for peace, and of course in Mines Action. The last idea that I want to transmit is what we think should be the goals for gender and arms controls as future challenges. One is to foster the protection of women overall in and post-conflict programs. Secondly, to focus on the new emerging issue of overall the worldwide technology. The third one, the participation and representation of women in arms control policy and diplomacy. As you may recall, in the last ATT meeting, according to the Secretariat, less than 30% of the delegates are women. Fourth, the communication and education that are fundamental. As you may know, May 24th was the International Day for Women for Peace and Disarmament. There was a high level of publicity in social media, but not as high impact yet. And last but not least, even if I didn't write it down, data and reporting and accountability that should never be forgotten. That's all from my side. Thank you so much for your time. And you have my contacts in this slide. And thank you again, UNIDIR, for this event. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Pilar, for putting, the conversation we're having here today in a broader context. I mean, we focused about the POA and the ATT meeting, but really there are many avenues in which we can pursue a gender-responsive approach to international security issues, and you highlighted the Summit of the Future and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So yes, for sure, these are also fora and also processes that we should make sure that also address the linkages between weapons and gender equality. So thank you very much for bringing these elements for our conversation as well. Now I'd like to turn to our second panelist, David Müller, who is a legal officer in the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. And the question we have for you, David, is in your view, what is the role of technical experts, people who are working in licensing process at governmental level? What is their role in implementing arms control in a way that prevents gender-based violence and advances gender equality? And would you have any best practices to share regarding arms control and prevention of gender-based violence?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for both questions. First, I will not speak as a technical expert, but as a licensing officer. I have struggled to call myself an expert on this, but yes. So my role as a licensing officer in promoting gender equality, it comes in both main aspects of my job. The first day-to-day activity as a licensing officer is to advise my government on whether or not a certain arms export is lawful and or desirable. So basically, in respect with gender, my job is to apply the provision of Article 7.4 of the ATT. How do we do that? Is through each time an arms export request comes through us, we launch an investigation on whether or not the legal criterions apply or political one also. And this investigation takes the form of a consultation to many entities inside the federal government, including our representations abroad in the country of destination mainly. And inside this consultation is a questionnaire. And we recently, like 3 years ago, we updated this questionnaire to have 3 questions pertaining to gender. So the first one is on GBV, rape, forced marriage, and such. The second one is on the issue of gender, broadly speaking, and the third one is on minority, among which sexual minorities. So what this does is allow us as licensing officer to gather specific information on gender, to analyze these data and to assess whether or not the weapons that are being exported present risks to allow GBV or any gender-related human rights violation. And the other effect that it has, at least we believe it, is that it raises a flag in the minds of the entities consulted that there is a link between weapons export and gender. And so many of the persons consulted are being diplomats. We believe it has an added value to remind them the importance of the gender issue when talking about arms export. And it will increase the likelihood of them raising the issue with their counterparts. So once these data are being gathered, we write an internal document with our analysis on the situation, and the criterion in which gender violations are assessed is called grave and systematic human rights violation. So this is why in Switzerland we do not forbid any arms exportation solely on the basis on GBV, because it's we use the umbrella term grave and systematic human rights violation. But we make sure, when relevant, to include in our analysis a chapter dedicated to GBV and other gender-related violation. So this is the first part of my job, and how we try to further gender equality. And the second part of my job is the multilateral part. So representing Switzerland in the ATT forum, for instance. And in this, I think it was best covered by the presentation before. It's participating, it's keeping up to date, it's encouraging projects. There we can, and we can remind our diplomats colleague how important it is for us to take this aspect into account, to support projects, and so on. So yeah, this is the two main ways in which, as a licensing officer, we can advance gender equality. And the second question was about the best practices. Yeah, so it ties nicely into the first question. So on the top of my head, I had 4 points. So the first one, related to what I talked about earlier, is to systematically raise the issue of gender when assessing arms transfer. So it helps with the gathering of data, it helps with raising the issue to our colleagues, and yeah, it helps to comply with our international and national obligations. The second one is to, as a licensing officers, to stay informed, up to date, and mindful of the issue, to, like I'm doing today, take part in discussion and to follow discussions, be mindful of the gendered impact of arms proliferation that was touched about earlier. And also, I think it's Madame Salama who talked about for technical experts to be in touch with the person inside of a government who specialized in gender equality. This is something we implemented in Switzerland, that we have some entity inside the government who specialize in gender equality. And we created a group in which we have frequent discussion meeting to talk about the subject and reflect on how we can advance the cause. The third point is quite easily ensure meaningful participation. I won't expand on that since it was already discussed. And the fourth and last point is data. The gathering and the availability of disaggregated data. The more data, the better, the easier our job. And so the best practice is basically to help in the gathering of data, to promote, to support data gathering projects. And on this, we relied pretty much largely on the civil society. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, David, for walking us through how, you know, the process of licensing takes into account the possibility of GBV, but also, as you said, as part of a larger consideration on grave and systematic violation of human rights. That's very helpful. And also thank you for sharing your views on best practices. The point about working together, you know, different parts of the government coming together to address this issue, I think it's very important and so timely in view of the ATT, as my colleague Hannah already highlighted, that the topic is interagency cooperation. And it's sad, but sometimes we feel that we see that some people don't think as gender as being an expertise or a technical area. And we have to remind them that yes, it is an expertise and it is a technical area that is part of technical cooperation as well. So it's great to hear that Switzerland is already doing this internally. And I would encourage Switzerland and other countries to also, you know, share how they are doing this at international level as well, because I think it's very valuable to show that you take, you know, this issue seriously, and again, you know, you're prepared to deal with it from the point of view of expertise and data and analysis, which is how it should be. The third panelist joining us for this segment is Henwei Luz from Control Arms. Henwei is the interim director of the this organization, Control Arms, which is a great partner of UNIDIR. I published in the chat a little bit earlier the fact sheet we did together on gender and the ATT. So it's great to have you here with us today, Henwei. My question for you, you know, reflecting on the journey of gender responsive arms control, what successes have states achieved, and what is, you know, still needs to be done? What would success look like in terms of gender mainstreaming this year in the ATT, but also in the POA? We'd love to hear from you.
Well, thanks very much, Renata, and thanks very much everybody else for joining, and greetings to everyone. And, you know, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here joining our close partners and friends, UNIDIR and the Small Arms Survey. So I'll get straight down to your questions, Renata. And, you know, in answering your questions, it will sound like I'm outlining a number of challenges and problems, but I promise you that at the end, there is light at the end of the tunnel. You know, just, you know, reflecting on the past 10 years and what was achieved in the ATT itself, it is important to recognise that Article 7.4 was a groundbreaking provision by setting out in a legally binding instrument the connection between the transfer of conventional weapons and gender-based violence. Hannah has already referred to the decisions that were taken at the 5th Conference of States Parties on Gender and the ATT. And, you know, I'd just like to add to that, that unlike some other past presidential themes, there has been substantive follow-up on the decisions that were taken on gender and the ATT. And substantive discussions have taken place under the Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation, otherwise known as the WGETI. And that has specifically addressed how states parties interpret Article 7.4. Also, discussions have taken place on mitigating measures under the risk assessment and how these can address the objectives of 7.4. And then there were further discussions this year under the newly formed sub-working group on emerging implementation issues, where clearly there is an appetite for continued discussion on substantive work on the ATT and gender. Now, for our part, over the past year, and with the generous support of the Government of Canada, Control Arms has assessed the advancements and obstacles encountered by ATT states parties in fulfilling the commitments that were agreed to at the 5th Conference of States Parties. This is presented in a report titled Monitoring Progress on the Implementation of Gender and GBV Considerations adopted by the 5th Conference of States Parties. And this can be found on the Control Arms website. And this work was led and completed by my colleague, Karina Samorano, who is online today. So questions should be directed towards her on these findings, and I'll briefly go through them. The findings were the result of a survey Control Arms conducted. I should note that that survey only resulted in a limited number of responses, and also research was conducted on open source information. A finding of our work is one that Hannah has already referred to, and that is that women are underrepresented in the ATT community, and especially the conferences and working groups. A key finding of this work is that only one state party has denied transfers predominantly for gender considerations. And we're also aware of one other case where a state party has denied a transfer predominantly on the basis of Article 7.4. And David almost scuppered my presentation by making the point that, of course, when states are conducting the risk assessment, they're looking at grave and serious violations. And what I would add to that is, often where you have serious violations of the rights of women and girls, and you have the presence of serious cases of gender-based violence, you also will have other serious violations of international humanitarian law and or human rights. So, overall, is this bad news? Have states, not achieved or lived up to the obligations of Article 7.4? Again, I would emphasize that substantive work has been carried out. It's not only been carried out by our different organizations, but as David has also explained, there have been good examples of states parties that, have really tried to raise awareness of this issue, not only within their systems, but in other fora. And what has to be kept in mind is that we now have a better understanding of both the opportunities and challenges towards implementing Article 7.4. Now, not only should you read the report of Control Arms, but a document that I do recommend everybody read, and, despite it being a lengthy one, and that is this year's WGETI paper that was prepared for the working groups and that I can't quite show on my screen. Here it is. And this is an excellent document because it outlines what is the state of play concerning the interpretation and implementation of Article 7. And so taking into account what we've found and also what has been outlined on Article 7, let me just go through some key issues on the implementation and realisation of the objectives of Article 7.4. And the first one is, and that's already been referred to several times, is about data and the sources of information. And this is really crucial to informing the risk assessment that is carried out under Article 7. And there is limited transparency surrounding exporting states' decision-making processes, and little is known about what sources of information have been drawn on and what weight particular sources of information are given in the final decisions. Of course, I would cite Switzerland as being an excellent example of transparency and a system that is informed by both IHL and human rights considerations. Hannah and both David, I think, have referred to this issue about making about needing data to make the connection between weapons and the harm caused. And this is an issue that's also been highlighted by Argentina in its work to develop a guide on good practices to prevent gender-based violence under the ATT. And at a workshop that Control Arms co-hosted with the government of Mexico earlier this year on ATT and gender, there was clearly an identified need to help states collect such data. So, do licensing officials have sources of information that they can easily draw on to inform the assessment? Under Article 7.4, there is clearly a long way to go on this particular area. Now, the next issue that I would like to turn to, and one that has already been referred to, is mitigating measures. And a critical question that is posed in the Wigeti paper is how to reconcile the long-term nature of risk mitigation and the instant nature of arms export decisions. And this is important for preventing gender-based violence, because prevention is an ongoing endeavour. Where serious gender-based violence is serious and widespread, it is difficult to envisage measures that could mitigate such violence. The Wigeti paper also referred to the fact that ATT states parties often refer to membership of international treaties as being a mitigating measure. While this is certainly a step in the right direction, such commitments must be confirmed in state practice. For example, it is insufficient for a state party to be a party to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. It must also be effectively implemented through legislation and policies. In other words, we're looking for confirmation that this is part of a state's practice, that there is a proactive approach. The third issue that I'd speak on concerning the risk assessment is the issue of denials. What information is communicated when a state takes a decision to deny a transfer of arms? And we know that, unfortunately, often denials are not made public, and that's because it's considered to be highly sensitive information and it's simply too sensitive to be publicised. And if a denial is made on the basis of there being serious gender-based violence, it would be our position that this is something that should be clearly communicated to the state that was seeking to import the weapons. And we would also hope that such information was shared with other exporting states. We know that this happens within the European Union, but when there are serious IHL and human rights violations, when it is an issue of gender-based violence or serious violence against women and children, this is something that we need to consider how to share more broadly. And this is really essential for ensuring that the ATT has an impact on preventing human suffering and really tackling the issues in Article 7.4 of addressing gender-based violence. Now, finally, and as is made clear in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, industry actors, including those in the arms industry, also have a role to play, and they have a role to play in protecting human rights. And that obligation is independent of the obligations of states. Therefore, the arms industry itself also has to be a part of this effort to prevent gender-based violence and to protect the rights of women and children. You, Renata, you asked me, what does success look like? And, you know, going back to the issue about the gender participation, it would be a diverse ATT community where women actively participate as office holders, deliver presentations and statements, and are recognised as being key decision makers. During the recent preparatory committee, Canada made an excellent point, and that is it's not sufficient to simply look at how many women and men are registered, but what role women are actually playing. And you know, the reality is that the current community of licensing officials in Europe is male dominated. And ideally, over time, this might change, this would change. But in any event, this community would be aware of the obligations of Article 7.4, and here David makes a very good point about needing to really systematically raise awareness of 7.4 throughout your national system. And also it would be ensuring that information not only on data, but human reporting on gender issues is easily accessible and well known to the licensing community. Again, we've come a long way in the first 10 years of the ATT. We now have a better sense of the challenges ahead of us and what is at stake, but clearly there is much to be done. So, Renata, thanks very much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Hinwei, for sharing these ideas and also for highlighting the publication by Control Arms, taking stock of how these actions agreed on CSP5 have been implemented. I think that's a crucial role, you know, that civil society and research organizations can play, which is in monitoring, tracking progress, and ensuring, you know, that commitments don't remain words on paper, but they actually, you know, get implemented. So thank you so much. I think this has been great points raised so far. Now I would like, you know, to open the floor to anyone in this call to raise their hand, pose questions, share ideas, best practices, maybe even challenges that they see for a discussion with our speakers today. We have, yeah, you can raise your virtual hand or type the question in the chat. I see there is one question in the chat. I also have some questions of my own, but just waiting to see if anyone would like to take the floor. Okay, I'll start by reading the question from the chat. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I would like to know if anyone is incorporating the gender dynamics of armed trade corruption in their work. I'm not sure this has come out in the conversation so far. But yeah, this is one open question for the group. I have another question for David and for Pilar, who are, working for governments. How can international organizations, research institutes, and civil society be helpful? Are there kind of any specific gaps that you identify in your work, be in terms of analysis or in terms, of practice, that we could think of actions that international organizations, civil society, and research institutions can be of help to people working in government? So maybe I'll give the floor to, I don't know if Pilar and David would like to address this question or the question in the chat, but also among speakers, if you have questions for each other, feel free to raise the physical hand or the virtual hand as well.
Perhaps I can give a bit of the answer, and Pilar can follow up on that. But what we expect from the international organization and the civil society is, I think, more of the same. It's two things for me personally. It's data, having disaggregated available data at hand when we are conducting these investigations, and organizing such discussions, exchanges, which are very, very valuable to us. So yeah, this is the two main points we are expecting from civil society and NGOs. So yeah, more of the same.
Yeah, from my side, I can only subscribe what you was said by my colleague, and also to underline that, as I said in my presentation, the civil society are fundamental actors. I mean, they are the drivers. They have the force to push, not only at a national level, but even at an international level. So.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I was ready to take notes of very innovative ideas, but I'm glad to hear, that what we are doing is very relevant to your work and helpful to your work. And the point on civil society, I mean, the gender agenda has been driven by civil society from the beginning. And I think it's very important that we continue to make room for civil society and ensure that they can participate in the discussions. I don't see hands. Okay, Hannah has a physical hand.
Thank you, Renata. I think the presentation by David was very interesting, and I had several questions in mind, but maybe just to ask about, the type of data you do find on gender-based violence. Where is that coming from? And, if you can speak a little bit to, how specific it is, or how useful it is. And what would you find useful? I think it's a really good idea that some of the speakers brought up, which is like, how do we build capacity in data collection in this area? I think that if we can show that it's useful, perhaps that there is a way to do this where we can also gather support, because I think that you need a certain amount of resources to gather this data. And this question is for David, but also for Pilar and others. And I see many state representatives that may want to comment on this as well.
Okay, so to your question, thank you very much. The answer is it entirely depends on what country we are talking about, what person we sent the questionnaire to. Sometimes we have to dig ourselves into open source investigation to find the data, but the most useful data is how much GBV are there, how much violation of human rights in regards to gender are there. Really, we make do with anything, but the more precise, the easier our job. So gender disaggregated data, use of firearms. Actually, in our law, we don't necessarily need the link between the weapons and the violation. There's an article for that, but we can also forbid an export based solely on the violation, whether or not there's a link. But for states that requires such link, that would be useful. But yeah, right now I cannot have specific lists of what we have. The more precise, the better. I'm sorry, it's not a very interesting answer, but this is the one I got.
Thank you so much. I see several hands raised. I'll go in the order that I'm seeing them here. So first, Callum, would you like to follow up or add points?
Yeah, just one very quick thing I wanted to raise is that obviously the Small Arms Survey is involved in the business of compiling data. And one of the challenges we've noticed is that on average, what generally tends to happen is that homicide statistics are collected on an annual basis, but in many countries, gender disaggregation happens only when there's a relevant project going on. So what we found is that on average, our gender disaggregated data, when we're looking at firearms-related violence, is between 6 and 10 years old. So actually, we're having a discussion at RevCon 4 using data collected before RevCon 3. So I'd be kind of curious to hear from some of the other member states or others in the room about whether there are mechanisms by which we can provide kind of more long-term support to both civil society organizations, perhaps also organizations working on national statistics to make sure that data is collected on a more regular basis, and when it is, then it's disaggregated. And I don't know whether it's useful to change kind of reporting templates to make this something that would be more useful. But noting that David did say this was something that's useful to Switzerland, I'd be curious to see if this is something that can be talked about within the framework of international cooperation and assistance. Thanks.
Thank you, Callum, for putting these questions to the group. I see next on the list is Canada. Brian, you have the floor.
Thanks very much indeed, Renata, and for colleagues, including our WIOG friends that have taken the floor earlier today. Yeah, I think picking up on what you'd asked earlier in terms of what exactly can help in terms of the IOs and civil society. I think first off, training for new diplomats. UNODA did its first in-person orientation course for diplomats in the disarmament sphere last September. And when you get these kinds of cross-cutting discussions, that's where you're able to see where the obligations are, where they're common and where they're perhaps unique. The ATT stands out as one of the ones that is unique given the GBV angle. I'd say that these kinds of events as well, where you're able to get together a more of a regional grouping, perhaps a smaller group of countries to share some perspectives. I think having that regional approach really helps. Not everybody has all the answers, and I think it's part of an iterative learning process, which we're all going through together. The ATT is 10 this year. Canada has only been part of the ATT since 2019. So we certainly get the benefit of learning from others' experience, whether it's learning from mistakes or best practices. I think both sides of the coin are always very important to have in mind. I'd say that the other element that you folks working in civil society in particular, you're able to see more of the trees, whereas I think as diplomats are looking at the forest in many cases. And when you're able to get that disaggregated data, you're getting into the leaves on the trees. So I think that that's a really important analogy to keep in mind. We're jumping from issue to issue on a weekly, if not daily basis. So I think having you there to remind us of what the obligations are and how others are implementing them is really important. And I think the last thing I'd say is just to reiterate what David had said in terms of the invaluable work that CSOs are able to do in this space in terms of getting more acuity on what's going on and where people aren't reporting. I think we were one of the few countries to submit a response to the survey. I think I saw one of my colleagues back in Capital that had really championed that, but I think that comes back to the issue of interagency cooperation. It doesn't strike me immediately as the most exciting theme. I'm sorry to the Romanian presidency in that regard, but the more I've learned about it over the course of the half year so far, the more it strikes me as actually quite primordial from a diplomatic perspective, certainly, in that I think the diplomats here, and more often than not, colleagues in foreign ministries that we communicate with regularly, are the ones that really have to kind of drive home that we have these obligations and that we have to do what we can to feed into the reporting and make sure that we're fulfilling those obligations. So yeah, I'd say that the responsibilities on the civil society and international organization side are manifold. But I think it's these kinds of conversations that we're able to have that really help solidify that important link. And sustain a lot of these obligations going forward, where the diplomats constantly turn over. You guys are some of the important brain trust that we have here in Geneva and in New York. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I think, we work as a community, everyone, doing their bit for, in the end, having something that is a better outcome for everyone. And from our perspective at the Gender and Disarmament Program, a gender lens, inherently leads to better outcomes. But yeah, thank you very much for raising this points. And I see next on the screen is Daniel Lee from the UK.
Thanks, Renata. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. I've just had admissions. Thanks just generally for organising this this session, first of all. I think just reflecting on what Brian just said, it provides evidence of the value immediately that civil society groups and other organisations provide in this space, not just providing the data, but also keeping track of progress and holding states to account on this, which we might grumble about, but obviously is an important thing to be done in this space. It keeps the momentum going, and it means that there are new ideas being foisted. So we can massively endorse that, and hopefully it continues within the ATT space, the POA, and elsewhere. We'll be supporting that later this year as well. I just wanted to reflect on a couple of other points in that space as well. I noted, I think, in some of the earlier presentations, the fact that it is not always a given that WPS work is linked to work on small arms and weapons and conventional arms control. We've certainly tried to operationalise that a bit within our own WPS National Action Plan to a limited degree. We refer to commitments on improving our own data collection on small arms and weapons policy, as well as the gendered impacts of our export control policy aligned with the ATT and the commitments there. And I think reflecting on the interagency theme and going back to what Brian was saying, it is incredibly welcome actually this year, because it speaks to so much of the challenge when it comes to data collection collaboration in this space. Certainly when we've been trying to operationalise the kind of improving our own data in terms of just policy and control, we found that there are significant barriers, because there are huge numbers of people involved in policy from different angles across the whole of the government, and getting access to the right people, and then even understanding whether they keep track of data on this is a challenge. It's something that's a bit of a work in progress, but the theme through the ATT this year has certainly helped in that regard, in terms of how we approach this policy internally, and how we link up better with our colleagues in other departments and other teams as well. Just on the data point as well, I think reflect everything that others have said in other states about value that civil society brings us in terms of informed policy. I am not someone who works on specific export control decisions, but we obviously work closely with the team that make those decisions. But I think the other point is reflecting what Hinaway talked about, which is on the weighting of that data. And talking about what Brian was saying as well about the benefits of a regional approach. And I think there is probably some value and mileage in having more regionalised discussions between states on how we are implementing and operationalising the criteria here. I think the challenge being, and I think that might have reflected the kind of lower number of responses and information coming out of recent surveys, is that obviously these are sensitive issues that states don't want to be sharing in wide circles for different reasons. Some are more open than others, but obviously we will have challenges in doing that. There is certainly, I think, opportunity in some of us coming together to discuss some of these things in a bit more of a kind of trusted forum, I suppose, just so we can understand how other states are operationalising this, and we can then inform our own policy from that. That may then also lead to kind of more open discussion where we know we're on a trusted platform with others in terms of how we're approaching this. But I don't think that's been done so much to date. So I very much endorse what Brian was saying there as a means potentially to kind of get over some of this as well. And it's certainly something we're, I think, keen to try and explore in the latter half of this year following CSP 10. So look forward to kind of picking up some other states on that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel, also for highlighting the linkages between WPS and arms control and how sometimes they may seem obvious, but it's not so easy to operationalize them in the distinct action plans and frameworks that countries put in place. I have a couple of other people who have raised their hands. I've also taken note of the questions in the chat. So what I will do, I'll give the floor to the colleagues who have raised the hand, and then I'll get back to the questions from the chat and then have a discussion with the speakers as well. But now I would like to give the floor to Australia, Demi Della Porta.
Thank you so much, Renata. And I just wanted to echo thanks from other colleagues to both UNIDIR and the Small Arms Survey for convening this event today. This is certainly an issue that Australia sees as being incredibly important and something that we are taking as one of our priorities into the review conference in a couple of weeks. I think we would certainly share some of the perspectives that my UK colleague has just shared on the challenges of operationalising really fostering gender responsiveness into our work on small arms control. Certainly from Australia's perspective, one of the ways that we try to support gender responsive approaches to small arms control is through our ongoing funding to the UN Trust facilitating supporting cooperation on arms regulation, or UNSCAR, as it's better known. And so for those who aren't aware, UNSCAR considers gender in the selection of proposals with priority given to projects that promote the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security. In recent years, UNSCAR has funded several projects focused on advancing the WPS agenda, including on disarmament and arms control components of Central America's WPS action plans, and enhancing capacity among parliamentarians to increase implementation of the WPS agenda and advance the prevention and reduction of small arms and light weapons related violence in East Africa, the Western Balkans, and Asia. So just a plug, I guess, I wanted to give, and certainly if states are interested in hearing more on the positive contributions made under UNSCAR to the WPS agenda and curbing the illicit transfer of small arms and light weapons more broadly, we'd very much welcome you to attend our side event marking 10 years of UNSCAR on the 21st of June. So that's the Friday of the first week of the review conference from 1:15 to 2:45 in CR5. So thank you.
This is great. Thank you so much for sharing this invitation to the side event. Today's conversation is very much, a pre-game for the UN PoA, which is happening in New York soon. And also, if you have, I don't know if you have reports or written resources about, the progress and the projects implemented via UNSCAR and how they have contributed to WPS. We'd be very happy, if you could share in the chat or point us to it, because it's a very interesting topic. Demi, I see you still have your raised hand. Is this a follow-up or no? Okay. So next on the screen is Natasha Loiso.
Hi, how are you? So happy to see faces that we have been working together in the last 2 years. Well, now I am on the civil society, working more on the academic sector. So I will be giving my comments and suggestions on certain issues that are coming up in the case of Argentina and some other Latin American countries regarding the continuity on the gender policies due to new governments. And especially in the case of Argentina, the new government has eliminated the gender issue from the public policy agenda. The Ministry of Gender was eliminated, and the National Agency of Control Materials has stopped producing statistics on gender. And also in March, ANMAC has changed the regulation on the preventing measures that the national norms permitted the state to limit the access of firearms to persons that had claims on gender issues. So this is this has been a preoccupation of a small group of academics that we are working on this issue. And I have to also mention that we managed to create an initiative within the academic society due to the work that we have done with Callum specifically and Luigi from Small Arms Survey, where they promoted new and young academics to get involved in the gender and firearms agenda. So we are very thankful about this motivation. Today, with this small group of academics, we are working on following up this agenda, but we also see that the Argentinian government is not continuing its guide of its good practices guide in the ATT. I don't know if we don't know if the Argentinian government has responded to the monitor, etc. So my suggestion is for civil society and academics to continue producing such kind of statistics and analysis. We need to have an international civil society that has more power, let's say, or more possibility of pressuring governments, pressuring in inverted commas, to hand in their statistics. Just for us to have the possibility of sharing, and as David mentioned also, the importance to control from civil society what our governments are doing in the national level and in the international level. So these kind of meetings and exchanges are very important for the academic society to be able to exercise their internal national control, and also to rise up to the press all these issues that are very important for gender prevention. So thank you, and I wish that we can generate more exchanges and strengthening the academic community in Latin America on this issue.
Thank you, Natasha. It's good to see you. And I just would like to share a note that we are organizing this as regional briefings with speakers from a regional group, but it's open to all. And I just saw a comment in the chat, someone from Southern Africa saying they have learned a lot from the discussion today. And this has happened in other regional briefings as well. We did one for Latin America and the Caribbean. We did another one with African states, another one with Eastern Europe. And in all of them, you know, we had speakers from the region, but also this exchange with participants who have similarities or differences, complementarities to share from other regions. So thank you very much for highlighting that. I see, David, you have your hand.
Yes, thank you. Since we have a few more minutes, I'd like to answer Anna's question, because I thought about it, and maybe I can expand on the answer. But first, I want to say to Natasha, it's good to see you back in the field. So the question about what kind of data, perhaps I can delve a bit deeper into how in Switzerland we assess the grave and systematic violation. So the grave part is quite easy. It's self-explanatory: homicide, torture, rape. So it's the act in itself. And the systematic part, we have 3 criterions. The first one is the scope. So how much, how frequent? The third part is the method. So is this only isolated events, or can we discern a pattern, a link between the violation? And the third criteria is how the authority, how the government responds to this violation. Either it can allow, it can turn a blind eye, it can, in some cases, encourage those violations or cover up for the culprits, or they can try to combat the violation through legislation, through policies, through the acts of other authorities. So this is the 3 criterions that we apply, and perhaps that can help target the kind of data you collect and the analysis you can provide, especially on the method and the pattern distinguishing. This is the hard part, mainly for the analysis. So I hope this was interesting, or it has some value to you. Thank you.
It's very interesting, David, and thank you for sharing this. One of the questions that were in the chat referred to whether people who are working on licensing, if they regularly interact with the data and the work of different frameworks dealing with GBV and situation of women's rights. For instance, they put here in the chat, SIDA Committee, Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Working Group on Discrimination. And then there are some acronyms that I don't know, MESEVI and Grevio, etc. So this just show that there are different institutions out there and frameworks out there that I'm not used to, encountering them in my work on arms control and disarmament. But I don't know about the others in this meeting. If anyone else would like to talk about, it's the issue that we always say about working in silos and how hard it is, to bridge this different world. Sometimes, it's kind of lost in translation. It's even different languages. But yeah, I see Henry has volunteered. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, it's just to say, Renata, there will be, in different human rights mechanisms and reports, there will be really useful information, but there is such a proliferation of information that it will really be a matter of going in there and extracting it from those different reports, etc. When there is an investigative mechanism under the Human Rights Council, that's much more obvious as a source of information. But there certainly is some work to do to make sure that information is very prominently presented to this community. Also, somebody earlier on asked a question about corruption in the arms trade and gender, and one organisation that might soon be producing work on this, and I think they have a couple of publications, is Shadow World, which is led by Andrew Feinstein in the UK. So that is something worth looking out for. And, just finally from me, thanks very much to everybody for the comments and feedback and suggestions. It's been very useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Callum.
Thanks, Renata. Yeah, and I'd like to thank Sven for this question because actually we ran a side event on this topic at the first Arms Trade Treaty meeting earlier in February this year. So I think what's interesting is the Arms Trade Treaty is not usually a forum to exchange information on human rights concerns, but the other fora such as the CEDAW Committee and the Human Rights Council would be. So something we're looking at is whether there's possibility for greater collaboration between these two fora. One thing that would also be interesting is whether some of the recommendations related to the implementation of the POA and the ATT could actually be made within fora related to CEDAW and the Human Rights Council. So kind of mirroring the fact that sometimes it's more effective to talk about women, peace and security concerns within small arms control mechanisms, if it's particularly pertaining to arms control and gender-based violence. It can actually be perhaps more effective to talk about encouraging both the universalization and the implementation of provisions related to the Arms Trade Treaty and the Programme of Action in the Human Rights Council. This is also particularly of concern to WEOG states because we find that those countries that are able to make recommendations related to arms control mechanisms tend to be the smaller ones because it's the same delegate in the Human Rights Council and the Arms Trade Treaty, whereas in many of the WEOG delegations, we actually find there's sometimes silos within the mission itself between those people who are responsible for arms control and disarmament on the one hand and on human rights on the other hand. So just to kind of push forward that notion of interagency cooperation, I think it's also important to facilitate sometimes intra-agency cooperation within our own missions.
Thank you very much, Callum. I think your point may resonate with different people on the call. I mean, even in small organizations, sometimes we're so busy, you know, focusing on one thing. And you're correct. There's a lot to gain in making sure we're doing our work internally in a more coordinated manner. I saw that the colleague has posted on the chat the explanation of the acronyms that I didn't know, and these are monitoring bodies related to conventions on women and domestic violence. So thank you so much for explaining that to me. And for sure, I learned a lot today. We are approaching the end of our call. I would like to say, you know, that I have learned a lot today, and I think this conversation is, you know, paving the way ahead for a lot of emphasis on gender, both in the POA and the ATT. And we're very pleased that you were all here today with us. I know everybody's super busy. I'm not sure, I know there are lots of people on this call. I'm gonna try to do something. I'm gonna ask if everybody can turn their cameras on and we will try to take a group picture. Let's see if this would work. Yes, I see people turning their cameras on. Oh, it's super nice. Okay. So we'll do the print screen over here at UNIDIR. So everybody smile. No, thank you so much. It's really great to see you all here and to be able to count on your active participation in this call. Before we wrap up, I just need to thank our partners, Small Arms Survey, all the great speakers that joined us today, everybody on this call for participating so actively, sharing resources, and also share also a very big thank you to the donors of the Gender and Disarmament Program, which are Canada, Germany, Ireland, and Norway for making our work possible. As I said, this is the 5th regional briefing we are doing on this topic. And we are a small team, so thank you very much, Hannah and Liam, who are on this call today. It's been a pleasure, and we will see you in New York, in Geneva, and online. And we'll be in touch. Thanks again, and have a lovely day, evening, morning, depending on where you're based.